Thank you all for being here. I am invariably gratified to see Vivaldi show up. I said to him, there's no room. Pushy Italian. But I'm always gratified to see the extent of civic engagement and thirst for knowledge and acquiring new and challenging information that I witness in our little part of the world. Friends in metropolitan America believe that we're otherwise very sleepy farmers. Evidently, we're not. So thank you for being here. And I want to start with a vast understatement, which is that the military strategies and military campaigns of the years 1914 and 1918 marked a gruesome departure in the waging of war. But for the Weimar Republic, the new German democracy, born soon after the guns fell silent, for them, peace too brought troubles that would lead to catastrophic consequences. And today, we'll explore life in the Weimar Republic, in Weimar, Germany, beginning with its preliminary stirrings in October of 1918, and ending with its demise in March 1933, and the consequent turn at that point to tyranny. And I hope that in the process we'll be better able to understand and to make sense of the terror that would then unfold. So, the war's drain on human and material resources left a lasting legacy, a lasting imprint on Europe, and particularly on Germany. Germans, trying to resume their normal lives, found the post-war years fraught with challenges at virtually every turn, ranging from the public sphere, such as discomforting political and economic policies or projects, to the most intimate domain of the family, whether to marry or even to have children. And in the years after the war, Germans truly and in a wholesale fashion brooded over their future, and indeed, if there was of such a thing as the future. And as expressed by the highly influential German philosopher Oswald Spengler in 1931, only dreamers believe that there is a way out. And thus it was that for Germans, peace too came with enormous obstacles. We'll unpack Germans' responses to post-war political, cultural, and economic crises. And we'll see that for some Germans, a generalized sense of loss hardened political sentiments, stoking militancy. Others cast about for answers in artistic endeavors. Some turned to spirituality. And for others, solutions to perceived crises were to be found in a comprehensive disemboweling of democracy. I'll concentrate on the war's legacy, starting with government reforms enacted just before the cessation of hostilities in November of 1918, up to the eve of the National Socialist Party's ascent to power under Adolf Hitler in February of 1933. So these two events bookended the 14-year lifespan of the Weimar Republic. Its birth heralded the crisis of liberal democracy, and its death ushered in the horror of Nazi dictatorship. I'm going to explore 5 dimensions having, oops, maybe 5 dimensions should be over here. Yeah. 5 key dimensions of everyday life in the Weimar Republic. And the list includes an underlying sense of crisis wherever you turned, the pervasive circulation of conspiracy theories, a tradition of geopolitics with concerns for Germany's position in European affairs, the impact of modernity, and finally, the population of veterans, a group that had once represented the soul of the German people, but which would become a cudgel wielded against them. Each of these characteristics will serve to understand the circumstances behind the Republic's birth and its demise. But for now, the important thing to keep in mind is that all of these items on this list were weaved into each other, forming a toxic fabric. We will also see that some of the arguments circulating in post-war Germany were not altogether new, but instead represented updated versions of long-held traditions. That is to say, we will come to understand that the ascent of National Socialism in 1933 cannot be explained as sui generis, as a phenomenon unto itself, as a one-off. For one thing, historians rarely see cases of one-offs, and instead, what we trace is the development of historical tropes, right? Of thematic continuities, and the evolution and adaptation of a people's foundational narratives. And finally, I'll wrap up with some brief conclusions. The Weimar Republic came into being as a result of a series of critical events during the months of October and November of 1918, known collectively in German history as the November Revolution. Under pressure from the military and political leaders who sought to strengthen Germany's position in the expected upcoming armistice negotiations with the Allies, Kaiser Wilhelm II finally agreed to reforms in the German constitution in early October 1918. These reforms essentially gave more power to the elected parliament, the Reichstag. Then, on October the 29th, a rebellion broke out in the Baltic seaport of Kiel, and together with soldiers and workers, the insurgents took over the military base, the city, and elected governing councils modeled after the councils or the Soviets that had been formed in Russia the year before at the start of the revolution. The Kiel revolt spread to several cities where insurgents similarly seized military facilities and appropriated civilian administrative powers. These were the early acts of resistance that inaugurated years of seemingly endless violence in the form of rebellions, coups, and regional secessions in Germany. But at the same time, the November Revolution launched a vibrant phase of German state building under a constitutional representative democracy. The largest political movement at the time consisted of socialist parties, which spoke mostly on behalf of laborers. And socialists were split into two major electoral parties. The radical Independent Social Democratic Party, or USPD, called for immediate peace negotiations with the Allies and advocated for a Soviet-style command economy. For its part, the more moderate, reformist Social Democratic Party, known also as the Majority Social Democratic Party, or MSPD, supported the war effort but opposed the autocratic rule of the Kaiser and favored instead a parliamentary democracy. A third actor on the left wasn't yet a party, and that was the Spartacist League, consisting of revolutionary communists who would soon form the KPD, or the German Communist Party of Germany. So this was the political backdrop on the left when on November 9th, 1918, the German Republic was proclaimed, quite unexpectedly, in the Reichstag building by Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the MSPD. And with this, the imperial German state, which had existed since 1871, came to an end. But violent struggles for political supremacy were unleashed, and they would come to represent an enduring characteristic of this new republic. On November 11th, 2 days after the declaration of the German Republic, and 610 miles west of Berlin, in the small northern French town of Compiègne, an armistice was signed between the Allies and the Central Powers, effectively ending military operations. And as agreed to, the signed armistice amounted to German capitulation without any concessions by the Allies. Back home, against a backdrop of political violence, elections to a National Assembly took place 2 months later, on January 19th, 1919, and the moderate MSPD won an overwhelming majority. The National Assembly then retired to convene and prepare a new constitution in the city of Weimar. For those of you who know about Weimar, it's the historical center of Germany's literary and cultural movements. That is to say, get it away from riotous, or seemingly riotous, Berlin. The new constitution provided for a parliamentary republic, allocating elected members to the Reichstag proportionally. And thus, the November Revolution of 1918 culminated in the birth of liberal democracy in Central Europe. The new government enacted extraordinarily progressive legislation that promoted the interests of labor. It enhanced wages, protected women and children in the workplace, advanced agricultural labor legislation, and provided protection even to domestic laborers. And nonetheless, the government faced repeated militant and even armed challenges to its authority. Army troops, aided by paramilitary units, were regularly called upon to put down armed groups and widespread labor agitation. Despite all this needed legislation then, the government continued to face widespread opposition. Troubles began soon after the November Declaration of the Republic. A leftist military unit mutinied on December the 23rd, 1918, that resulted in fatalities. On December 30th, the Communist Party of Germany was officially formed. It incorporated the Spartacist League and other revolutionary left organizations. Weeks later, the Spartacist League took to the streets of Berlin in an armed attempt to establish a communist government. Bloody street fights culminated in the beating and killing of several revolutionary leaders and the arrest of many, many others. And as extreme left-wing rebellions spread, the Soviet-style aspirations of the insurgents drove fears among German centrists and conservatives that the country was on the verge of a communist revolution. For the next 5 years, the federal government would respond brutally to mobilized resistance. The army, and especially the government-financed militia, the Freikorps, committed hundreds of acts of gratuitous violence against political demonstrators and striking workers. These were the responses of the historically authoritarian and militaristic reflexes that were retained from the empire by the Weimar democracy. Ultimately, the Freikorps grew into a paramilitary organization largely outside the control of the government, yet supported by and in close coordination with the German officer corps. We'll talk more on the Freikorps later on. Meanwhile, revolutionary leftist resistance came in different forms, from the short-lived Bavarian Socialist Republic, proclaimed in Munich in April of 1919, to rebellions in Saxony, Hamburg in March 1921. A workers' uprising in the region of the Ruhr in the industrial West brought together 50,000 people who formed the so-called Red Army that took control of the regional state. They too were put down violently by the army and units of the Freikorps. And then, towards decade's end, several days of fighting broke out between communists and the Berlin police in the 1929 May Day demonstrations. Casualties were reported to be in the hundreds. Rebellions also erupted from the right, as when 12,000 Freikorps members participated in the Kapp coup and occupied Berlin in March 1920. Supported by a secretive conservative faction within the military officer corps. Workers rushed this time to the government's defense, and the rebellion collapsed after 4 days. Additional rebellions from the right included the Beer Hall Putsch, staged in Munich on November 8, 1923 by the Nazi Party. A group of 2,000 or so armed members of patriotic and nationalist groups allied with the Nazis and provided legitimacy by the participation of the revered war general Erich Ludendorff, took over a meeting that had been organized by the Bavarian prime minister. The government's legitimacy, indeed the very existence of the Weimar Republic, was questioned by the right. Nationalists and conservatives repeatedly proclaimed their resentments of liberals, communists, and Jews, blaming them all for Germany's defeat in the Great War, which to them was the predicate for the end of Imperial Germany and its replacement by liberal republicanism. Not surprisingly, they demanded the restoration of the Kaiser and a pullback from democratic practices. By the second half of the 1920s, street fights had morphed beyond the violence of strikes, coups, and brutal countermeasures. Now, in the second half of the 20s, political parties of both the extreme right and extreme left themselves organized their own stormtroopers, thereby orchestrating and amplifying street violence. The KPD, or the Communist Party, organized their followers for the purposes of engaging in violent encounters against right-wing militants, as was the case with the RFB, established in 1924 as a communist paramilitary organization. One of its members, by the way, was Erich Honecker, which may ring a bell. He was the leader of East Germany until 3 weeks before the wall fell in 1989. For its part, the Nazi Party too organized its own paramilitary organization with the goal of battling the left. This was the Sturmabteilung, or the SA, also known as brown shirts. Containing political violence was very difficult, in part because of the highly fluid nature of party membership and the inconstancy of ideological allegiances. So that in 1933, 70% of the SA members had been former communists. Legislative stalemate in the Reichstag, along with frequent changes in the membership in the Chancellor's cabinet, further eroded credibility in liberal democracy. And by contrast, radical parties made significant electoral gains and increased their representation in the Reichstag. And thus, after the elections of July 1930, communists and Nazis together held about 40% of the seats. And then, 2 years later, in the elections of July 1932, voters gave the Nazi Party the plurality of seats. Hitler would be appointed Chancellor 7 months later. It is hard to talk about Weimar Germany without the pervasive sense of crisis that people felt. The term crisis was used extensively to describe a wide range of conditions. Between 1918 and 1933, almost 400 books were published in Germany with the term crisis in the title, let alone the thousands of articles in newspapers, journals, and periodicals that echoed this trope. Crisis was the term used to account for the state of legislature, of agriculture, of finances, of industry, the economy, capitalism, revolution, religion, gender relations, public morality, cultural in general. Pretty much all of German life was seen to be in crisis. But the studies of the period show that in fact there was a crisis, but identified specifically as a crisis of German democracy. And these concerns deepened after 1930. These studies identify ineffective governance and fractious party politics as causes for the sense of crisis. And electoral results illustrated the eventual narrowing of choices in early 1933 to only two options. Either the continued use of Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed for the declaration of a state of emergency, or the formation of yet another cabinet under yet another chancellor, this time Adolf Hitler. The underlying sense of crisis threaded through multiple layers of Germans' everyday lives. For example, a sense of crisis gave way to a new rise of spiritualism, particularly in Berlin. In November 1922, Kati Kollwitz, a graphic artist and sculptor and an icon of the German modern art, wrote in her diary the following. On All Souls' Day, I went to the Reichstag to observe the memorial for the dead of the World War. At such moments, when I know I am working with an international organization opposed to war, I am filled with a sense of warmth, of contentment. I am content that my art should have a sense of purpose. I would like to make a difference in these times when people are so perplexed and in need of help. Many feel the obligation to help and exert influence. Others are moved to follow obscure courses of actions. My friend wants to preach action, she puts in quotes, but he means inward action. A turning away from the outmoded models of life that have been proved wrong. Some are preparing the soil for a new life of spiritual liberation. And then there are all the groups preaching a new eroticism, a sort of religious bohemia. All this is reminiscent of the Anabaptists, of the times in the 16th century when, as we witness today, the great turning point in history is proclaimed with announcements that the millennial kingdom is upon us. Spirituality in Weimar Germany engaged both the left and the right, and included the so-called Germanic religions, that is, Christian and proto-Christian movements adapted to a mythical and uncorrupted German folk, which united, as Fritz Stern described it, a Christian heaven and a German earth in one impenetrable mystery. The number of so-called barefoot prophets and inflation holy men multiplied following the cumulative shocks of first defeat in the war, the 1918 revolution, then hyperinflation, and then the Great Depression. In 1932, Rudolf Olden, a leading liberal journalist, published in Berlin, Prophets in the German Crisis, a book about miracle healers and spiritual sects. Olden claimed that the presence of over 3,000 so-called wizards practicing in Berlin alone reflected a general shift away from the rational and instead toward the irrational in contemporary German politics. In Olden's words, in moments of crisis, rationality is pushed aside. Its weapons, which used to be well honed, are suddenly blunt. German liberals and supporters of the Republic accuse political opponents of irrationality and of oversimplifying explanations and presenting solutions to any crisis using a simplistic understanding of complex economic and cultural conditions. Some of these seers heralded a new spiritual age. So-called messianic leader figures, or messianische Führerfiguren, urged their followers to seek salvation by transforming the political religious character of the German nation. Among such messianic figures was Adolf Hitler. The underlying sense of crisis also fed into the perceived need for national redemption and rebirth. Achieving this quest incorporated familiar ideals related to empire, but also to irredentism, that is to say, the reincorporation of German territories that had been lost through the Versailles Treaty. These were not, however, ideas held exclusively by nationalists and conservatives. Anti-Nazis, too, such as Waldemar Gurian, a prominent Catholic intellectual, proposed restoring the empire in order to revive the positive aspects of German nationhood. Professor Gurian became an exile and went to teach at Notre Dame until his retirement. And finally, this overarching sense of crisis undermined Germans' sense of security. And thus, many sought answers by turning to utopias and doctrines of salvation and to solutions that used dramatic narratives to present answers promising to reduce a very complex world into simple solutions for a better future. Now, to be clear, ambitious political figures understood the notion of crisis not as a web of conditions destined to doom Germans' futures, but instead as the platform on which they could launch a better future. By adopting one of two radical political paths. In other words, the world was forlorn, yes, but the degeneration that threatened the nation's body and soul could be reversed through drastic measures. Newspapers and other publications on both the left and the right thus saw their current conditions, their current moment, as precursor to better times, but only through a radical alteration of society. For communists, the difficulties of the Weimar economy indicated the impending end of capitalism and subsequent social and economic regeneration. And thus the choice of the moment was either to prepare for a slow, agonizing end, or to hasten the only other available option, the quick establishment of Soviet Germany. The well-known communist intellectual Rosa Luxemburg pointed this out at the end of the war. She wrote, "We are standing as Friedrich Engels predicted. Either the triumph of imperialism and the resulting destruction of all culture, as ancient Rome had experienced with depopulation, desolation, degeneration, an enormous graveyard, or the quick victory of socialism." For their part, the National Socialists envisioned similar options. For Nazis, one of the choices for Germans involves racial and genetic declines, followed by total annihilation in the event of either a continued status quo or a communist assumption of power. Resonating with Rosa Luxemburg and her prediction of a dire future, Adolf Hitler in 1932 warned that a communist victory would lead to, quote, "an endless time of barbarism, a decay of mankind with unbelievable misery and centuries of backwardness." Such a path to the long-term decay of civilization would be the necessary result of Germany's racial decline. Avoiding the decay of civilization required the regeneration of Germany's soul along with its racial and ethnic recomposition. So in sum, extremist political actors pointed to crises everywhere, claims of German carnage, if you will, and used such imagery to justify proposed radical strategies and draconian policies. So let me talk about conspiracy theories. You might not have heard about the term, but let me talk about it just the same. The Treaty of Versailles was widely unpopular among Germans, right? But it was conservatives, nationalists, and former military leaders who condemned it most strongly and who most persistently used it as a tool to delegitimize the government and its supporters. Conservatives and nationalists subscribed to the so-called stab-in-the-back thesis, or myth. That is, that the explanation for Germany's acceptance of the armistice first, and subsequently of the Treaty of Versailles, was to be found in the corrosive work of anti-German conspirators and unpatriotic collaborators. The belief in civilian betrayal by the so-called November criminals originated with Generals Paul von Hindenburg, commander of all forces of the Central Powers during the war, and his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, who visited us in the beer hall putsch. Over time, Such finger-pointing expanded to include significant segments of the political class that had supported the treaty and who, along with socialists, communists, and Jews, were seen as having questionable loyalties even to the current nation. Jews felt particularly vulnerable. Without support from powerful nationwide organizations such as political parties or labor unions, Jews could only respond defensively. This is a poster that was put up by the Jewish veterans of the war, essentially reminding all Germans that 12,000 Jews fell dead, 120,000 were mobilized, and that they shouldn't be listening to party propaganda that would try to divide all Germans. Eventually, all liberals, perceived to be opponents of German nationalism, were accused of betrayal. And in the mix, too, were organized labor groups who, in 1917 and 1918, had staged massive unrest and strikes in critical military industries. As it happens with many conspiracy theories, this one benefited from a certain logical credibility. After all, went the argument, at the time of the armistice, in November of 1918, German forces were still occupying France and Belgian soil. While in the east, the Russians had been defeated and had signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. Back in the west, Germany appeared to have gotten the upper hand in the spring offensive of 1918. So surely, obviously, the ultimate cause behind the armistice had to have been the work of traitors and collaborators. The evidence is before us. But the reality was different. The fundamental reason for Germany's loss was that it was fast running out of resources, both human and material. And then, starting in April of 1918, 10,000 fresh troops were arriving daily from the United States, and along with them, the industrial military output of America. By the end of September, the legendary impregnability of the Hindenburg Line, which cut primarily north-south through much of Belgium and part of France, that line was smashed by Allied troops. The Allies' remarkable industrial war-waging capacity was lethally illustrated by the nearly 950,000 artillery shells that were fired in only 24 hours, just prior to the assault on the line. As for labor organizations and their activities, the strikes that took place in late 1917 and early 1918, they were the responses to the continuous drop in real wages. Aggregate real wages in Germany, as a percentage of those in the United Kingdom, had been steadily rising for some time, from 76% of UK wages in 1901 to 83% in 1913. But that upward trajectory, reaching for equality with the UK, came to an end with the war. And real wages among protected industries, war industries, had fallen between 1914 and 1916 by nearly 22%. Real wages among all other industries by 42%. And the wage increases decreed by the Kaiser were essentially wiped out in the spring of 1916 by the inflation. The steep drop in real wages was accompanied by significant food shortages, which developed soon after the war started as the British blockaded the North Sea and supplies coming into Bremerhaven and Hamburg and other ports in the north came to an end. While in the east, grain supplies from Romania and Russia were shut off. So that German imports of dairy products declined by about 80% between 1916 and 1918, meat imports by 96%, flour imports by 95%. Domestic agricultural production could not compensate for these losses. Germany underwent a very rapid urban growth starting in 1871, which meant that the country turned to the outside, to the exterior, for the importation of food, which cost them dearly during the war. And matters were made worse by a political economy that subsidized agricultural production, in contrast to the largely free trade regimen under which British agriculture had operated. So that this meant that German agriculture had not been forced to modernize nearly as much as had been the case in Great Britain. And thus, 35% of the German labor force was dedicated to agricultural activities in 1913, compared to 8% in the UK. Which meant further that with the arrival of general mobilization, 40% of the male labor force, and the most able-bodied, was withdrawn from the agricultural sector, reducing production capacity significantly. Sharp decreases in both food production and food imports resulted in periods of starvation. 250,000 Germans died of starvation in the unusually cold winter of 1916-1917. By then, the average caloric intake per capita was 700. And thus, the hundreds of thousands of strikers who took to the streets of Berlin in January 1918 were responding just as much to communist labor agitation as to the government's mismanagement of the economy and its ineffective prosecution of the war. Germany's defeat provided a new context for interpreting and advancing the historical German view regarding the relationship between geography and the power of the state. A new geopolitical analysis developed in the 1920s under the Weimar regime, and it held that Weimar Germany was locked in a life and death struggle for survival, threatened from the outside by the imposition of the Versailles Treaty, and internally by the Republic's own declining biological energy, manifested by its continuously depressed fertility rates, which by 1933 stood at 48% of what it had been in 1914. For many intellectuals, the nation depended for its survival on restructuring spatial conditions, that is to say, specifically its borders, and also on teaching Germans to think of their nation in geopolitical terms. For these intellectuals, the path to recovery from the disaster of 1918-1919 rested with rethinking the model of the state so as to make it into a living organism nurtured by a geographical sensibility and a demographic recovery. These became the key ingredients of the defensive nationalism that increasingly informed the German political discourse. Central to the concept of the state's geopolitical capabilities was the idea of space, or Raum, that is, space for Germans and peoples of German descent to come into the orbit of the German state. Raum, or specifically the racially tinged and diplomatically aggressive Lebensraum, has traditionally been associated with Hitler's expansionary policies into Central Europe, such as the annexation of the German-speaking Sudetenland, which had been awarded to Czechoslovakia in the Versailles Treaty, or in 1938, or the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, also in 1938. But in fact, the interpretations of Raum in the 1920s were shared by both the nationalist right and the social democratic left. It had long been an ingrained concept of imperial Germany as far back as the 1870s and 1880s, and had formed an important component of the Kaiser's military vision in 1914. It was Karl Ernst Haushofer who nurtured the intellectual development of Raum. Haushofer had been a military officer during the war and then professor of economics. He saw geopolitics as a science, devoid of partisanship, and indeed, a great swath of German population subscribed to these ideas independent of political affiliations. But despite assertions as to its scientific basis, Raum was actually built on pseudoscientific notions by individuals with spurious scientific credentials. And thus, a traditional military and political strain of German statecraft was enhanced by the post-Versailles academic community and then advanced further by writers and activists across the German political landscape. The novelty in the post-war articulation of Raum was not found in its relationship to European power politics, but instead to its essentialist thesis, in its linkage to the nation, to the folk. Yes, these notions were eventually captured by the Nazis, but they were now being built on imperial traditions, and they resonated with a wide swath of Germans struggling to make sense of their military loss and diminished stature in the European stage. The twisting of Raum into Lebensraum with its racialist vision of German expansion represented simply the Nazi reconfiguration of long-held historical ideas that were now elevated to orthodoxy. So all this traditional talk of the state and the folk, of expansionist geopolitics, takes place right alongside with the modernist culture that flourished in the Weimar Republic. Weimar modernity was vibrant, eclectic, but it also illustrated the contradictions and resentments as it coursed through every thread of Weimar's social fabric, from science to culture. It shaped developments in urban planning and design. Think here of the Bauhaus movement, in technology, in medicine, in spirituality. Change appeared to be everywhere, some of it shaking down known truths to the core. Freud's deconstruction of our thoughts and advancing the essential role of our libido loosened the moral strictures that had been in place since even before the old empire. Einstein's work on theoretical physics, for which he won the 1921 Nobel Prize, upended the centuries-long understanding of our universe that since the 17th century, Sir Isaac Newton had assured us would be perpetual. Popular culture and intellectual trends in science and the arts were not the properties of any single political faction. Artistic endeavors were not the exclusive domain of progressives. Conservative critiques of modernity and modern urban life also became part of the modernist discourse. And in fact, German conservatism had displayed since the 19th century an ambivalent and contradictory history of both resistance and awkward accommodation to modernity. Modernity encompassed science, and German scientists were seen by their countrymen as agents of liberating knowledge and advancement. At the same time, mystical notions became attached to material progress and also gained currency, such as the interpretation given to the term the power of the will, der Wille zur Macht, coined by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in the late 19th century. Nietzsche was highlighting the main driving forces among humans: accomplishment, ambition, the quest to reach the highest possible attainment an individual could attain. And such a notion was predicated on freedom. However, this too was appropriated and substantially reframed by Hitler as an essentialist theory that reduced nations, entire peoples, along a social Darwinist hierarchy of achievement. And these racialist notions eventually occupied a significant share of the German popular imagination. Conservative nationalists proclaimed the virtues of the German folk, that is, the community of blood, race, culture, which in their view served a higher calling compared to the destructive forces of capitalism and liberalism. Furthermore, the virtues of the folk served to counter the dangers posed by cosmopolitanism, that is to say, the antithesis of nationalism. But at the same time, new German technological products, the results of capitalist industrial capacity, were greeted enthusiastically, including German radio, German statecraft, German aircraft, German automobiles, German cameras, German cinema, German design. And images of sexually liberated women challenged the traditional constructs of domestic, maternal German womanhood. Beginning in the late 19th century, German conservatives had endowed nationalism with anti-modernist, romantic, with a capital R, and irrationalist components. A prime example was Paul de Lagarde, a prominent theologian and public intellectual whose writings in the 1870s and 1880s would provide intellectual guidance to Alfred Rosenberg, who met his fate at the Nuremberg trials as the Nazis' most prominent ideologue. In his writings, Lagarde mocked materialism, the business world, and the literati. The virulence of his contempt for equality, progress, and Jews, seeing them all as corrupting agents of a pure German ethos, found echoes decades later among Weimar's traditional conservatives. And then, by the latter 1920s, such views found a new synthesis, adopted by some conservatives and by just about all Nazis. This synthesis reconciled the social elements contained in the criticisms of modernity, that is, they rejected the foundational values of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, but awkwardly came to terms with the materialist effects triggered by the Industrial Revolution. This was the ideology that Jeffrey Herf calls reactionary modernism. Traditionally, German conservatives had spoken of the choice between technology or culture, with a strong preference for the second. They rejected Western materialism and instead idealized the German pastoral spirit and expressed nostalgia for Germanic rural values. And by contrast, reactionary modernists in the 1920s taught the German right to think in terms of technology and culture, a strategy designed to foster and project German power while remaining true to the German soul. Reactionary modernism would be fully implemented by Hitler once in power. By April 1923, near the height of Germany's period of hyperinflation, the exchange rate had grown to 24,000 German marks to the US dollar. After that, exchange rates reached the depth of worthlessness. The ranks of the needy had swelled significantly, such that by the spring of 1923, the Labor Ministry was distributing welfare to 6.6 million Germans, approximately 10% of the population. The Weimar Constitution guaranteed welfare benefits to its needy citizens. But among those needing assistance, the veterans of the Great War required more than such promises held out. What does this mean? The imperial state began to curtail private philanthropic activities in 1917, seeing them as a drain on the war effort. Later on, the Weimar state extended such limitations by legislating itself as the sole legitimated and regulated provider of welfare, in part as a device to garner the public's loyalty. But with such concentration of distributive authority came excessive expectations for delivery. And in the end, the Weimar state did not entirely succeed in winning the loyalty of its veterans. However generous the veterans' pension may have been, as Deborah Cohen wrote recently, it was, quote, never enough to compensate for a leg, the loss of vision, or a disfigured face. Disabled veterans in Germany wanted public recognition of their losses. They wanted an honorary place in society. They sought respect and public displays of gratitude, end quote. But the state's monopoly over welfare benefits and distribution meant that the veterans' interaction with the state became routine and the process bureaucratized, devoid of public celebration or displays of veneration. And finally, the financial weakness of the Weimar Republic reminded everyone of the fragile nature of welfare allocations as occurred in mid-1930 with a series of economic decrees that cut welfare expenditures in order to address shortages in the federal revenues, measures that the National Socialists exploited for their own needs. Discontent and disapproval turned into mutual resentment between veterans and the larger public. In Britain, veterans viewed the public as their best ally. In Germany, veterans came to regard their fellow citizens with animosity, and that hostility became publicly expressed. The pages of over 530 right-wing journals published during the life of the Weimar Republic gave voice to the growing disaffection with Republican government and civilian society in general by veterans, among others. Veterans' discontent led them into questioning the very existence of the Republic. And in the end, the greatest political beneficiaries of such alienation were the National Socialists, who assiduously courted this vital constituency, capitalizing on its discontent. By 1920, the German public's historical goodwill towards veterans had nearly disappeared. Now they were seen as greedy opportunists, as being better off for receiving disability pensions than ordinary Germans who had to struggle relentlessly with difficult economic conditions. Veterans had gone from being honored victims in 1919 to being derided as just another bunch of moochers. And the gratitude of the fatherland, so amply expressed during the war, turned to apathy in peacetime. Many veterans reacted to the combined effects of economic difficulties and public hostility by responding positively to appeals to defend against leftist radicals. By some estimates, hundreds of thousands of veterans joined the paramilitary units known as the Freikorps, and acted as shock troops against communists and suspected anti-government groups from the left. To be sure, most veterans successfully reintegrated into civilian life, but many others were driven to militant action by resentments and by resistance to new democratic modalities. The Freikorps stood as one of the most extreme representations of the post-war culture of combative activism. The veterans' stridency was propelled by notions of exclusive comradeship, nurtured by the masculine community of the trenches, and by their estrangement from a seemingly degenerated society. Their ideology celebrated a soldierly nationalism. Many subscribed to the conservative voices whose politics honored the Blutgemeinschaft, the community of blood, that is, the nation's spiritual unity, and favored it over and above the Geistgemeinschaft, the community of mind, the rational intellect impelled by the Enlightenment. And in the event, they attacked abstraction and intellect while celebrating intuition, the self, and immediacy. Veterans organizations propagated authoritarianism, militaristic values, and the mobilization of anti-democratic sentiments that eroded support for the Republic. The Freikorps extended its reach by recruiting young Germans who had not served in the war, but who sought a taste of military life and the camaraderie that bridged class and status into a unified German people. Many veterans were unable to demobilize psychologically and found shelter in the abundance of military voluntary associations and in the Freikorps, yearning for a new social and political order. In 1920, a young Freikorps officer wrote to his commander his sense of what the war generation needed to do on behalf of the nation. "We must enter politics," he wrote, "and try to create a generation of leaders which unites the courage to act, the character, the firmness, the energy, and the composure of the soldier, with the spirit, flair, and snake-like cunning of the politician. This is the task of the generation of the trenches," he wrote. These veterans and their political sponsors advocated soldierly solutions to seemingly intractable problems. And records indicate that as many as 1.5 million men participated in the Freikorps between 18 and 1923. And as many as 500,000 men are estimated to have served actively. The impact of the Freikorps lasted well beyond the life of the Weimar Republic. Significantly, some of its leaders would go on to become important figures in the Nazi regime. Among them were Ernst Röhm, future head of the SA, Heinrich Himmler, future head of the SS, Rudolf Höss, the future commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and many others. And finally, although we don't have the exact evidence of a linkage between needy veterans and support of nationalist and anti-communist parties, unemployment tracked closely with right-wing voting for Reichstag seats between 1930 and 1933. So let me conclude. The punitive measures against Germany included in the Versailles Treaty have often been identified as among the principal causes for the eventual downfall of German democracy and for the turn to National Socialism. But that story does not hold well. German democracy came to an end for many other reasons. Faith in German democracy was steadily corroded by the seemingly incessant attempts to bring down democratic institutions, by the pervasive militant street fights, by financial despair, by a humiliating sense of diminished capacity on the European stage, by the contradictions and resentments associated with elements of modernity, and by a nation that turned its back on its veterans who then struck back. Some of the political constructs that Weimar Germans heeded were not of their own generations, but instead they were repurposed historical tropes, hearkening back to German political and cultural traditions. And thus both nationalists and liberals, less so communists, shared similar convictions regarding nation and territory historically embedded in the German body politic and in the long-held sense of citizens' obligation to the mystical German nation. At the same time, some of the post-Versailles features of German society were not so unique. The spiritual turn among Germans and their searches for reductionist solutions to complicated issues would similarly be found in Great Britain and the US. Think of Houdini, debunking psychics and mediums in the 1920s. Spiritualist seance parlors, radio preachers in the 1920s and 30s, such as Amy Semple McPherson and the Questioning of Science. The Ouija board, which spiritualist Pearl Curran popularized as a divining tool in World War I. To be sure, the trauma and drift that followed from military failure and humiliation had a lasting impression, leaving many Germans susceptible to immoderate responses. But in this, too, Germany was not unique. The Dreyfus Affair in France took place in the context of Germany's annexation of the regions of Alsace and Lorraine after the French defeat more than 20 years earlier in 1870-71. An event that fed the most extreme versions of French nationalism and anti-Semitism. The trauma of that defeat might have seemed far away in France in 1894, and yet such was indeed the vengeful spirit evident among the participants in the Dreyfus Affair, many of whom were Alsatian revanchists. And closer to home, a sense of national drift and collective ennui were widely observed in the United States in the post-Vietnam War years, lasting, some say, until 1984 and the arrival of A New Morning in America. And finally, responses to a sense of cultural loss or to perceived erosion of long-held foundational values can lead to unpredictable consequences in different locations and different eras. Here, the nationalism observed in the US in the early 1900s comes to mind, particularly as it took root in the South and the rural West. It was generated, in part, by the popular reaction to rapid industrial financial, and demographic changes that were seen in the cities of the eastern seaboard and elsewhere. It represented a response by traditionalists to an urban development that signaled an America no longer reflecting its rural heritage. And in Germany, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, it was in the regions of the hinterland, such as Bavaria, not cosmopolitan Berlin, where right-wing nationalists voted most strongly for National Socialism. And so we have seen today that the post-Versailles story was complex, containing multiple facets that range broadly across the economy, culture, and of course politics. But in addition, I hope we've had the opportunity to consider how elements of this narrative find resonance beyond the Weimar space and time. Thank you. You have no idea how dry I am. I would be happy to engage in any questions, answers, challenges. I only play a professor on TV. Yes, ma'am.
Did you discuss the role of the brown shirts and the long knives, or that's not relevant?
There were several strategies to the street fights. And the brown shirts and the RFB and some of the other groups, their strategies are the same, which is to engage in violence, partly as a visceral response to the other side, because the other side is no longer German. The other side is the enemy, right? So it allows for violence. And second, to keep alive, right, the ideological representations of their parties and their movements. So in some ways, you could say, at a considerable cost to social order, that the stormtroopers are functional. And they were, in the end.
But didn't Hitler murder them? That's not true.
First of all, that's a detail. By that I mean that in 1934, when the SA was getting a little bit in the way of some of the other members of the close circle to Hitler, by then Germany was Nazi. But they were terribly useful in the second half of the 1920s and thereafter. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Right. So German.
Repeat the question.
If I may summarize.
I'll keep an eye on it.
Don't correct me. These contents speak to the fragility of liberal democracy, and that the case of Germany may represent, in fact, such an example, that its legacy was more Teutonic than liberal, than Western liberal, and that Germany itself is the result of a Prussian testosterone over the rest of the German states, forming finally a unified nation. The testosterone you didn't mention, but I thought it was illustrative. Germany had similar experiences to Italy. That is to say, it was a fragmented nation consisting of states with varying levels of relationships. And the wealthiest and strongest, historically, was the Prussian state. And it is, in effect, the Prussian state that, after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, says to the rest of the Germans, now, you want to engage in the next war so divided? Because we bore the brunt. How about if we form an alliance with several guns pointed at several political leaders of the different regions? So that it's born out of a strong effort at coalition building. Not unusual in other fragmented states in Western civilization. So the question, the response I would give is that look to the violent treatment by security forces and the undermining strategies of the Army Officer Corps for an example of what I'm about to say. That the legacies, the heritage of undemocratic practices, right? And rather strong social control measures are still embedded in the Weimar state. So what we have is, and the judicial system was loaded with conservatives. Let's agree that judges tend to be conservatives to begin with across the land. So that what I would say is that the Weimar Republic is born with horribly weak institutions, under terrible conditions, both external and internal. If you were a betting man, you'd say, this can't last. The question is, which direction does it take? But was it the result of Teutonic dispositions towards violence? My people don't do that. My people look at tropes and traditions, and the traditions of institution building are traditions that take a very long time. The Brits don't even have a constitution. They wouldn't know how to write one if they depended on it. And yet, here they are. So what I'm thinking is Weimar is weak, is born weak, and the intellectual liberal class in Berlin never warmed up to it because it felt it was artificial. And it was artificial. It's born subtly, right? The MSPD says, let there be a republic.
Well, excuse me, wasn't it born as, it was almost, you know, the military government could see the end was nigh. It stepped back and allowed a civilian government to be born in order to take the stab in the back pressure.
No, what have you been reading? No, the military had its hands full trying to make the best out of negotiations with the Allies that had been going on for some time.
Do you see any similarities between the conservative movement then and the right-wing conservative Tea Party type movement here?
I'm having a Bobby De Niro moment. You know what that looks like? In Taxi Driver, he's standing in front of the mirror saying, you talking to me? The thing about the Tea Party that does not fit is that the Tea Party, for the most part, had no ideology other than small government. It has no ideology other than small government. Get off my back. That's a feeling. That's an ibuprofen reaction. It's not an ideology. The question is whether the conservative movement, leave aside the Tea Party for a while, the conservative movement resonates with some of this. And the answer is, it depends on which conservative movement in America you're talking about now. Right?
An economic question.
Sure.
At the beginning of the 30s, we have a nation that's, I believe, living on 700 calories.
Yeah, 20. No, during the war. During the war.
But a nation that's still in a state of economic collapse with hyperinflation and the like. And I just juxtapose this against the pictures we have of the tanks rolling into Poland, maybe 5 or 6 years later.
Right.
How did that turn come about? You had this terrific misallocation of labor with
I have my next talk, but it starts at midnight. To be fair, Weimar underwent financial crisis in beginning late 22, 23 and 24. Hyperinflation is tamed. It has some nice recoveries in 27, 28, and much of 29, and then 1930 hits the West in general. But you can produce a lot under a centrally mobilized economy, which Weimar did not have. Let me go to that side. Yes, sir.
Somehow you have not mentioned the reparations that had to be paid by the German state to the Versailles winners.
Right.
And what kind of impact that had, number one, in the German versus the other impact. Also, the occupied territories had a lot of things to do with because the core of the steel industry in the Rhineland was under foreign French control. I was also mentioned that in my mind the SPD under Ebert did a heroic job to make the thing work with the reparations. They almost got there, and then the Depression wiped it all out.
So it has been traditionally said that the extraordinary payment reparation schedule, as written by the treaty and negotiators afterwards, was the principle. I mean, no country could survive such payments. It was bankrupt from the start.
Not true.
The problem is that they never remotely paid that. Furthermore, except for the French, who were really stuck in the mud, the Americans in particular and the British recognized that the initial burdens by Versailles were untenable and renegotiated plans, the Dawes Plan in 22, I think. There are 2 or 3 plans aimed at reducing the burden, right? So that at the end of the day, right, reparations turns out to be a non-issue. To be fair, it is nerve-wracking and the source of a great deal of negotiations and attempts by the Germans to, you know, make the best of things. But in the end, nothing remotely to what was demanded. So,
I was going to say that.
yes, sir.
I agree with you that reparations had nothing to do with it. The Germans could have paid the reparations easily too, but they didn't want to, which it makes sense. I was going to bring about the Jews. The Jews in Germany were active in Weimar. They unfortunately were a large part of the delegation that
Did some of the negotiations.
yes.
Yeah. Well, but let's be honest here. For conservative Germans, by which I mean individuals who view Germany in its idealized version, right? Teutonic, right? Aryan, Germanic. I'm not talking about race. I'm not talking about religion. Right? We could be Protestants, we could be Catholics. But as a folk, where in the world do you find that Jews are part of that? How can they? So from the conservative German perspective, the response to Jews has historically gone from muted to spurts, but in their writings, the intelligentsia was generally anti-Semitic. What I would want to impress upon us all is that anti-Semitism comes in various flavors. And except for Paul Lagarde and a few others, German conservatism and anti-Semitism tended not to be eliminationist. Eliminationist anti-Semitism evolves, and it's not part of the central conservative thinking.
I understand that completely, that really modern anti-Semitism came out of France and England, not Germany. But unfortunately, Jews were very active in the negotiations and were blamed for the stab. And of course, it may be true also that during the devaluation there, because of the occupation of the Ruhr and the attempt of Weimar to subsidize the strikers there,
Yeah.
that some Jews became very wealthy, owing money on property also in Germany.
Fair, but it is equally true that Jews formed, some would say, I would say, a disproportionate share of the leftist intelligentsia, including the communists. And so they're salient.
Yes.
They could be in Congress for all I know.
Right.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
To the hyperinflation issue, and I'm trying to form my question to get my head around it.
I'm here for
now,
you.
you had mentioned that reparations did not necessarily play,
Not as stipulated by the treaty and its subsequent
but
articles.
huge reparation payments would have attempted to be made, at least initially.
Sure.
So I guess my question would be, when the what did Germany have of value that they would be able to make the payments with? Were we on a gold-based standard? And was the hyperinflation triggered as those reparation payments were made and what they had of value?
No, reparations are to the extent that you make reparations, you do it in hard currency, not your national currency. So the hyperinflation is the result essentially of the state printing money, right, to pay for its considerable expenses. It's a real, it's very, very simple. I mean, I've lived under hyperinflation. Let me tell you, wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning, milk is 10 cents, you go to bed, it's $4. And somebody's just printing money to pay for services. And the German state, the Weimar state, provided a great many services.
And is that printing of notes triggered by the reduction in their treasury as a result of the reparation payments?
No. First of all, the proceeds from industrial output is severely diminished because it's the Allies, and particularly the French, that are reaping most of those benefits. So sources for revenue, hard currency, are very difficult to find under the first 5, 7, 8 years.
They were being absorbed as quick as they were being made?
Well, they were not coming into Berlin to begin with. But you gotta provide something, print the money, pay.
When the French occupied the Ruhr, the German government approved of they should go on strike. And these strikers, and it wasn't just a few, I mean it's a whole huge area, had to be subsidized. So
yeah, it costs money to run an inefficient state. Yes, sir.
And when they did go on strike in the Ruhr, didn't the government encourage the strike and also just print the money to pay them?
Yes, not wholesale, but elements of the government and elements of the military did. Yeah. But that was sort of strategic. The idea is to get the French out of there. And in the end, they did. Yes, sir.
I have one more question. In all of this cauldron, was there a way to avoid it?
Jesus H. Was there not a way to avoid the ultimate results of 33, right? So here's the way I operate. It's a bimodal question you're presenting to me. If I say, yes, it was avoidable, boy, am I going to be having a hard time explaining it. But if I say, no, it wasn't avoidable, then I'm going to gloss over a great many details of goodness in the Weimar state. In the end, without betraying my own ideological preferences, I submit to you how easy it is to be seen by many people as charismatic and by believing what he says. It's remarkably easy. You don't believe me? Watch the last 2 years of television. So the unavoidability question, to me, rings true. It's unavoidable that under the conditions of a weakened Weimar state, a fractious society, a battered psyche, a whole bunch of teenagers riding bicycles and lifting their skirts, that the only thing that we need to do, boys and girls, is to restore order.
Yeah, I go back before that. I mean, that's an effect. It's the cause that sent them down that road that started with World War I. I mean, to me, it was just one big war.
Oh, I know where you come from.
Right.
No, I'm not Manichaean. My world doesn't operate in those. We look at patterns and traces. What could have been, I don't know that it could have been. I honestly don't. Yes, sir.
It seems that this is a state that was born in crisis, as you pointed out, and had crisis after crisis after crisis, and didn't have the consensus of support within the population for its institutions and the way they function under the guise of the Weimar structure.
Correct.
And that was
who can win? Yes. Yeah, it's very difficult. And even German liberals who supported the idea of a parliamentary republic generally recognized that the way that Weimar was born and constructed was not to be. It was just a matter of time. And not that they were pessimistic, it's just that the buy-in, the sense that the state is us and we are the state, that line was divisive.
There was no political cultural foundation that supported it and its institutions.
There are no stakeholders of enough size and cross sections.
The question.
Oh, let me go to the gentleman behind you. 1 second.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, one of my college texts was a book written right after World War II called "Germany Tried Democracy." The implication being that they did not come from a democratic heritage.
Right. The imperial state has a strong judiciary. Right, law is very important historically in Germany. It has a strong social control set of mechanisms. Prussia, in particular, it always did that. Parliament, the Reichstag, was a relatively poor cousin to the Kaiser until the declaration of the Republic. And frankly, when you have a fractious parliament, right, it tends towards stagnation or towards stasis, right? If times are difficult, publics across the lands tend to be decreasingly tolerant of those kinds of party games. If you don't believe me, call 911, ask for Great Britain.
So
the Reichstag was fractious. It was riven by personalities. And the public, by 1930, saw the Reichstag, saw parliamentary democracy as not functioning, period. So are you going to go Rosa Luxemburg's way? And by the way, she was killed in the riots of 1919. Or are you going to go in Mr. Hitler's direction? And as some places, including ours, say, modernation is just not part of that political vocabulary. Yes, sir.
Let's make this the last question.
You have the last question. Don't let it go to your head.
Can you make the point that a lot of these things happen because the middle class lost their stake in the state due to the inflation?
I don't think so, because inflation was tamed.
For my family, that they got economically wiped out during this phase.
Right. But by the late 20s, the economy had been doing reasonably well.
Yes.
Reasonably well. I'm not saying that there weren't members of the population that have been wiped out, but it doesn't seem to be, in fact, there doesn't seem to be a middle-class centered response to the government. It cuts across. Anyway, thank you all so very much for your engaging questions. Appreciate it.